Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Whenever I ask guests on the show who their influences are or what writers they are particularly excited about, there has been no name more often mentioned than that of today's guest, Kelly Link. From Karen Russell to China Mieville, she has become a touchstone for many, prompting Neil Gaiman to declare her a national treasure and for Michael Chabon to describe her as the most darkly playful voice in American fiction. Her stories have won the O. Henry Prize, garnered Hugo and Nebula Awards, and appeared in Best American Short Stories. Her collection, Stranger Things Happen, was a Salon Book of the Year and a Village Voice favorite. Her book, Magic for Beginners, won the Locus Award for Best Short Story Collection, and her collection, Pretty Monsters, was a finalist for both the World Fantasy Award and the Locus Award. Kelly Link is also co-founder of and editor at Small Beer Press, and its zine, Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet, which between them have published work by the likes of Ursula Le Guin, Karen Joy Fowler, Maureen McHugh, Ben Parzybach, and Lydia Millett. Kelly Link is here today to talk about her much-anticipated 10 years in the making new book of stories, Get in Trouble, a collection the Boston Globe calls ridiculously brilliant, and Publishers Weekly adds that Link's characters, driven by yearning and obsession, not only get in trouble, but seek trouble out to spectacular effect. Welcome to Between the Covers, Kelly Link.
Hi, my pleasure to be here.
Let me just start out with the title. I love the title, Get in Trouble, and the fact that it's an imperative that seems to implicate the reader. Is there a story behind how you arrived at that as the title of the collection?
I think at the point where maybe I had 2/3 of these stories and it became clear that I would have a collection at some point, every night before falling asleep for about a week, I would lie in bed with my husband and we would come up with really dumb titles for collections. One of them was novel. One was, just random sort of silly ideas, which because we were on the point of falling asleep was a lot of fun to do. When I began thinking seriously about a title for the collection, when we were getting ready to send it out to people, editors, to take a look, there wasn't a particular story title that felt like it would work for a coherent whole. But it was really hard not to notice that all of the characters in the stories were people who got into messes. And so I started thinking about that the folk saying the devil finds work for idle hands. And so thought about find work for idle hands, which felt fancy. And in fact, there's a Donald Ray Pollock collection, or novel rather, that has a similar title. And so sort of boiled that idea down to Get in Trouble. And that seemed to fit the characters.
Well, in doing preparation for today and reading other interviews that discuss the theories behind what might unify some of these stories to be all part of the same collection, I haven't come across my experience as a reader of what I thought was one of the through lines for Get in Trouble. So I wanted to propose it and see what you thought about it. So as I was reading Get in Trouble, the thing that really jumped out at me that kept reoccurring is this idea of doubles and doubling and doppelgangers. So we have people with two shadows. We have a ghost story with two identical haunted houses. We have a surrogate mother. We have surrogate animatronic boyfriends. We have faces that act as avatars in a story. And we have Marine, the operating system of a ship, who also sort of acts as a double consciousness for people as well. Do you feel like that's something that is part of Get in Trouble? And is that a fascination of yours when you're writing stories?
Yes, absolutely. I think very early on I wrote a story with twins in it, a ghost story. And after I wrote that story, I was always really a little sad because I really couldn't do too much else with twins. I've done it occasionally, but you use something that you like a lot as an item in a story, and then you can't keep on doing it. Instead, you do it in sort of different ways. So there are a ton of doppelgangers in this book.
What do you think that doubling does for narration for you? What sort of effect is it lending the story?
in a story, if you have a doppelganger, it creates a kind of useful uncertainty. There's kind of a shiftiness. Traits may move back and forth, or people may take on each other's roles, and it makes the ground maybe a little bit shiftier too under the reader's feet, which could be a bad thing. But if you're doing it intentionally, you can certainly use it to make a story that much spookier. And I do think in general, there's already always a kind of doubling that goes on in a story anyways, because the reader, there's the kind of identification that goes on between the reader and the writer, maybe the things that the writer wants you to experience that then you do experience. So you're kind of a shadow for the writer in that moment. And then there's the kind of associations or attachments that people have to the characters in a story, and maybe the moments in which you separate a little bit and you think, I wouldn't do that, or I don't like this person anymore, or you pull back a little bit. And so that kind of identification or doubling, or maybe then separation at certain points is, part of writing a story is figuring out how to make a reader attach or pull back, or sort of progress through a series of emotions about a story or a set of characters.
It's interesting that you mentioned that it's sort of inherent to writing itself, because it also feels like the reader's wonderment about the writer's life outside of the story is a sense of doubling that haunts the story too, even when there's nothing necessarily overtly autobiographical in one.
Well, I mean, even when, and I think often there is nothing directly autobiographical, but stories still come out of certain sets of preoccupations that a writer has.
Right.
It may be autobiographical in the sense that it is telling you something about the interior life of people when they sit down to think about stories or narrative.
Sure. And another thing that's interesting in Get in Trouble is that a lot of the stories are have protagonists that are adolescent girls. And I feel like adolescence is an interesting doubling time in a sense, because you're part of two worlds at the same time, and you're not part of either at the same time. So it almost feels like a sense of doubling, but also disembodiment.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a little bit. When I was a kid, my dad was a minister. He was a pastor. He then worked at a seminary, and then he ended up in graduate school. He got a PhD in psychology. And, he would bring home his homework. A lot of his homework was learning how to give specific sets of tests. So he gave us, these tests as sort of a form of practice. And, we did the Rorschach blots and things like that. And that was, I think that was probably useful training for being a writer, because he would, hand us the sheet and say, well, tell me what you see. And then we'd sort of say stuff, and then he'd say, okay, interesting, but wouldn't tell us anything. So it was, I think, this sort of confirmation that it was possible to see many sorts of things in an image or in a story, and that the point wasn't being right or wrong. It was just what you could pull out of it. And now I've lost the question. I think it was adolescence anyway. So, I think one of the things about it, I think that we are multiple people in our adult lives as well. We're different people at work or with our family or with certain groups of friends. But I think the thing about adolescence is you're at a point where you're learning to become those multiple selves. And much of it feels very false because you haven't fully figured out who to be in certain kinds of contexts. And so there is that sort of weird, you're trying too much or you're trying too little, or you're trying out something that really doesn't pan out at all. And by the point that you're an adult, most of us have figured out, I think without thinking too much about it, who we are supposed to be in certain kinds of relationships. And maybe at a certain point in your life, you decide that you're not happy with who you are. Or if you're lucky, you like the person you are at work, and you like the person that you get to be at home, that all of that is, in fact, very comfortable.
So in a weird way, there's the paradox of like looking for the mask that is the most authentic.
Absolutely.
Or the persona that is most reflective of what you want to be in that scenario.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't mean any of this in a bad way. I don't think it's a bad thing that we are not always the same people depending on the context. I think it's actually pretty liberating, the idea that you do not always have to be the same person. It would be kind of awful to be confined into being the same person all of the time. Or I don't know, maybe in fact it would be, very Buddhist, very, very, to sort of be the same in every context.
We'll talk a little bit about the epigraph by Basho, the haiku, year after year, on the monkey's face, a monkey's face.
Yeah.
That feels like such a great intro to this enterprise of Get in Trouble to me.
Well, that's a poem that my husband read and loved, and I loved too. He went through a period where whenever we were with a group of people, he would ask people to draw a monkey face, in part as an homage to that poem. So somewhere we have a big stack of drawings of monkey faces. But, as far as poems go, you look at it sometimes and you think that is a really depressing poem. And at other points you think, no, that's just, that's fine. That's the way it is. And I guess the context for the poem is that I don't remember the holiday. It may have been sort of a New Year's holiday, but monks would go around with monkeys. And in fact, the monkeys would wear a mask on this night, a monkey mask, which is, again, just that image is kind of really striking.
Yeah. Well, let's have you read a little bit from the collection so people can hear the prose and Get in Trouble.
So this is a small part of a ghost story called Two Houses, which is about a group of astronauts on a very, very long voyage, and they are having a birthday party and are now telling each other ghost stories. And this is one of them. At the time of this story, my great-grandmother was a girl of 8 or 9. She went to school for part of the year. The rest of the year, she and her brothers and sisters did the work of the farm. My great-grandmother's work was to take the cows to a meadow where the pasturage was rich in clover and sweet grasses. The cows were very big and she was very small, but they knew to come when she called them. In the evening, she brought the herd home again. The path went along a ridge. On the near side, she and her cows passed a closer meadow that her family did not use, even though the pasturage looked very fine to my great-grandmother. There was a brook down in the meadow and an old tree. There was a rock under the tree, a great slab that looked something like a table. My great-grandmother didn't like that meadow. Sometimes when she looked down, she saw people sitting around the table that the rock made. They were eating and drinking. They wore old-fashioned clothing, the kind her own great-grandmother would have worn. She knew that they had been dead a very long time. One day, my great-grandmother was leading her cows home, and she looked down into the meadow. She saw the people eating and drinking at their table. And while she was looking down, they turned and looked at her. They began to wave at her, to beckon that she should come down and sit with them and eat and drink. But instead, she turned away and went home and told her mother what had happened. And after that, her older brother, who was a very unimaginative boy, had the job of taking the cattle to the far pasture.
We've been listening to Kelly Link read from her latest collection, Get in Trouble. You've talked before about how stories can operate under daytime logic and nighttime logic. Can you talk about that in relationship to these stories? What is nighttime logic and how are you implementing that in the stories that you write?
These are terms that there's a writer, Howard Waldrop, came up with. He's mostly a short story writer. And so the difference, according to Howard, is that daytime logic is kind of everyday logic. It's, you sort of set your alarm and the alarm goes off at a specific time, and your day sort of happens. And if things go wrong, if the coffee machine breaks or something like that, there's no sort of feeling. You don't have a feeling of unease about it. And with nighttime logic, I think in life or in a story, there's kind of a pattern that you feel, maybe intuitively, and there does appear to be a logic to it, but it is not the logic of alarms going off and coffee machines breaking, and sort of it's a sort of a pattern in which there appear to be consequences to things, and things appear to be taking very strange turns, almost in a dream logic kind of way. And I am pretty sure he avoided using the term dream logic just because, with dreams, I think you wake up and you think that made absolutely no sense. And in fact, all the power sort of goes away. And I think with nighttime logic, with stories, you may not understand the progression of the story, but you feel that there's a sense, a guiding sensibility behind it.
You're a writer who has a lot of crossover appeal between straight sci-fi fantasy readers who only read sci-fi and readers who never read sci-fi fantasy who read you also. And I've been wondering about that phenomenon and wondering if it's partly related to this doubling phenomenon also. On the one hand, that you foreground the ways in which the everyday is really weird. And then when you portray things that are really fantastical, you portray them as very ordinary, often within a story. And it feels like, in a way, you're surprising people around their expectations in both senses. But I was curious how useful you feel like these genre distinctions are. You are definitely straddling worlds that only have somewhat of a Venn diagram overlap. But are they useful to you?
Yes and no. I mean, science fiction, fantasy, horror versus sort of the fiction that you find in the fiction section of a bookstore. You're going to find some surreal or fantastic stuff in fiction anyway. So there's already a kind of seepage.
Well, what about in terms of, are you conscious of writing within a specific trope and then maybe trying to change the expectations around it as you're writing in it?
No, I think actually that this is my failure to write heart of genre stuff. I did grow up reading fantasy and science fiction, and the places where I wanted to sell my work to were the pulpy genre magazines, which I still love a great deal, Asimov's and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. But I have a very hard time writing I guess, what would be, to me, they seem like very straightforward ghost stories, but they don't quite fit into that slot sometimes. I have been published in those magazines, but that took some work, because, in fact, the stories did not feel like straightforward genre stories to the editors who were buying the stories. I think that part of it is just marketing. It seems to be a weird distinction between audiences for fiction and, movie-going audiences, for example, that people will go see superhero movies and they will see dramas or thrillers or romantic comedies or even young adult movies and don't really think twice about it. But when people read books, sometimes they really feel that they're supposed to stay on one side of the divide, which is a strange phenomenon to me.
Yeah.
And so, my goal, at least with the people that I know are my friends, is always to get them to read stuff that I think that they would like if they were reading a little bit farther afield. So I have a couple of people that I think of as my test group that I will give science fiction or fantasy books to and see what they think. And I often start with young adult fantasy. That seems to be a great gateway to getting them to read more genre work.
Right. Well, it's interesting you talking about wanting to write a certain way and then not the way your writing turned out was different than what your original intentions were. There's this interview you just did for the Millions website, and part of it, one of the pieces of advice you gave to writers is sort of gone viral on the internet while you've been on tour. Yeah. But it said, lean on what you do well. Being well-rounded as a writer isn't the goal. I would love for you to elaborate on that sentiment, and maybe if you could just touch on some of the ways in which you realized these are my strengths and these are the things that I don't do as well and I'm just not going to do them.
I can probably complicate that advice a little bit. When I say lean on what you do well, what I also mean is you have to use that to compensate for the other stuff. It's not as if you can think, well, I'm great at, really descriptive, evocative passages, so I should concentrate on that and skip characterization altogether. You have to find a way to make the stuff that you're good at work for characterization as well. And I thought for a long time, I'm not sure what I think now, that I was not particularly good at plot. Couldn't actually figure out what plot was. So I sort of avoided, filling in what seemed to me to be the plotty bits of stories, sort of sped up around them or, sort of pulled back, especially in endings, and tried to find a way to make a story work without doing the stuff at the ending that just seemed to me that I just didn't really want to do. I was really weird about endings seemed very strange to me. The idea that you were supposed to tie everything off neatly. And so I had to find a way to leave a very open-ended ending in such a way that it was not incredibly frustrating to all readers. I think there are probably still people who are enormously unhappy with how my stories end, but other people seem to be okay with it.
Well, I think part of the reason why there's such an appeal to the quote that is traveling around is that there's a sense of liberation, that you don't have to be symmetrically good at every aspect. When we had George Saunders on, he was talking about how he was really good at voice, and when he finally realized that if he just leaned into voice, he could get everything else eventually. Like, he doesn't have much setting. He does have setting, but it's more
he shows
suggested.
You what he wants to show you, yeah.
You might not even know what anybody looks like in the entire story.
Which I like a great deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, the other part of that is not just to do it well, but to push so far on the stories. You're really in your own territory by that point. So sort of push it really far, almost out of shape, until you're doing something slightly different from everybody else. And I will say the caveat to that is that the stuff that begins to be easy for you to do as a writer, eventually you have to stop doing it, or else the stories all start to feel like the same story over and over again with small variations. And I think, again, the way around that is to keep on pushing in that direction until you've moved somewhere completely different, or else to take something that you really, really, really hate and try and figure out, how to do that in a new way. Whether, again, I'll pick characterization or plot, because those are things typically that make people very uncomfortable when they start out writing. So maybe if you really suck at characterization, figure out a different way to put characters together, to convey them on the page.
Can you think of an instance in this collection of a story that came from pushing into an area that you really don't normally want to go?
Yes. So I'll give two examples. So in this collection, there's a story about two superheroes sitting on the side of a mountain. And I was feeling a little uneasy about dialogue. Kind of liked writing it, but I was not sure. It felt my dialogue was beginning to feel a little stylized to me. And so when I started writing that story, I only wrote it as dialogue for maybe the first 10 pages. And that was, again, dialogue is part of characterization. I was trying to find a way into creating, two different people and making them seem really distinct from each other, and only allowing myself to do that through dialogue. It was a lot of fun. I really like the people in that story, I think in part because it was so much fun trying to figure out how to convey them just with words. And when I finally hit the point where I needed to add some other stuff, I went back to the beginning and I added as little as I could that wasn't dialogue. And that ended up being I'll probably do that again at some point. And then the other story is a story called The Lesson, where I wanted to try some stuff with paragraphs. And in part, this is because I am interested in paragraphs right now, but also because I was still thinking about a story that I read in workshop years ago by Jonathan Lethem called Press Enter, which I love, which is, as it turns out, all one paragraph, which I didn't realize when I was reading it. But then in workshop, people began to either sort of praise it or question it. And so I went back and I thought, didn't even notice. So I read through it, and it seemed to me that, in fact, he'd pulled it off, that it was, in fact, one enormous chunk of text which flowed very naturally. And so for the lesson, I thought, well, I'm going to see what I can do with paragraphs. But because of the sort of material of the story, even though at first I was thinking, well, I will make these paragraphs, and in fact, they will flow. Then, in fact, it began to feel more appropriate to the characters in the story to jam things together in enormous paragraphs, even though you would not normally expect those things to all be pressing up against each other.
It reflected something about the people.
Yes, and the situation.
That was my favorite story in the collection.
Oh,
the lesson,
thank you.
that and Secret Identity. But the lesson, it kind of blew me away, the paragraphs in the lesson, because of all the things that you don't normally find in them, but how well it actually worked as is. It felt like a daring feat that was pulled off as if it was effortless. But
I felt very dissatisfied for a while because, in fact, I was just jamming things together, and then I realized that there was a reason why I wasn't breaking them apart. But it's a very choppy feeling style, and so that was the last story I wrote for the book. You know, it's still sort of a little bit new for me to go back and think about some of the stylistic things that I was doing there, and whether or not I think they're entirely successful. And so I go back and I think, well, that's really choppy. It sort of has a very weird kind of syncopated beat to it. And I can't decide if I like it or not.
And then but you have characters who are cut off from other things going on in other places also over and over in the story too, which is interesting. In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Kelly Link about her latest short story collection, Get in Trouble. I want to talk a little bit more about experimentation because I was in this literary genre divide and seeing people talk about you. One of the people that I often see associated with you in recent reviews is Alice Munro from the literary world. And I was surprised on a first thought because I think, like, in terms of tone and vibe, if I were to describe you to somebody who'd never read sci-fi, I would say somebody more like, imagine Lori Moore if she wrote science fiction and fantasy, or put science and fiction and fantasy into her stories. But the more I thought about the Alice Munro comparison, I thought there was a lot to it in terms of how experimental she is, and yet it doesn't leap out as difficult or call attention to itself in that way. And so I was thinking about Get in Trouble. You have the story Secret Identity, and you alternate between first, second, and third person in a story that's embedded in a letter. And then the lesson, you have dialogue, some of it in real time, some of it summarized in long paragraphs without quotation marks or descriptions of the people speaking. And then lots of other things, like in Valley of the Girls, there's strange formatting. I would love to hear more about some of these choices you made.
I've said this before, I don't actually like writing all that much. But the things that do make me enjoy it, or the things that are pleasurable about it, are often problems of technique, or sort of setting certain kinds of things that then have to be solved in such a way that the story reads naturally. So if I have a really interesting problem in a story, then the rest of it becomes much more enjoyable to write.
Do you start ever with a constraint? Like, I want to write a story where I use all 3 points of view within a letter and see if I can pull it off. Is it a sort of self-challenge?
With Secret Identity, it was more that I really like epistolary stories and I wanted to write one. And then because it's sort of a story which is an apology, but it's also an explanation and then sort of a summary as well, that moving back and forth between, and also because you're writing from the point of view of somebody who's really worked up, and so they are going to be slipping back and forth anyway. I think one of the biggest problems with narrative in prose is timing and pacing. It's not really so much of a problem, I think, in visual mediums or in music, or it is, but I don't understand those problems. I just see the end result, which is that it feels like there's no issue. But the problem is the problem of pacing. And so I'm often thinking this isn't moving fast enough. How can I get the story to flow in a faster way, or sort of move the reader along at a speed that feels exhilarating? And doing things like switching between points of view or switching tenses is often a way either to slow down a story or to speed it up, and hopefully a way that is not a challenge, but is more just sort of a way of increasing the stickiness of a story, making somebody invested in it.
You also play with form in another way that a lot of these stories are quite long for the short story form. They're 25 to 40 page stories. Do you feel like there's something about what you're working on in these stories that they end up at that length?
Well, I have been told by my friend Holly Black that it means that I'm probably headed towards novel territory. These stories are getting long, which I didn't really think about until I was writing maybe the last 3 or 4. And even the lesson, which the last story I wrote, I meant to write as a very, very short story and could not, in fact, keep it down to 5,000 words. I was sort of talking a lot to Holly Black as I was writing that story, sort of told her some of the things that I wanted to do. And so we often work together. So I would sort of look up and say, I think I'd be at maybe 2,000 words. And I'd say, I think this is going to be at least 6,000 words. And a little later I'd say, I think I'm heading up again. I think it's more like I can see the ending receding from me. And to be fair, actually, that story I also wrote backwards for a while. I started with the ending and moved backwards as long as I could. So I did have an ending that I was moving towards, so I could see it very clearly moving away from me.
Well, you mentioned that you don't get a lot of pleasure out of the process of writing, and I've also read that you thrive when there's distraction.
Yes.
Can you talk about that? There was a couple things, both that you thrive with the distraction, and that also when you feel stuck, you'll type out other people's stories. I would love to hear more about that.
The part where I sit down and begin writing a story, unless I'm really lucky, and things go well in a way that they usually don't go, I just can't stand the sentences that I'm writing. I look at them and they feel, it's like gum without any flavor, or something that you've been chewing for a long time. And that's fine as a sentence, but it's not, doesn't feel like it is part of something that I want to write. And I even feel this way often about email. When I write email, I will write the first sentence of an email to somebody and think, that's a terrible sentence, or that's an okay sentence. It's terrible to write okay sentences. And so if I don't have some distraction, then what I'm doing is I'm really just looking at the sentence and thinking, why would anybody bother to write a sentence like that? What is the point? And if I'm distracted enough, then I can keep going for long enough that then I can come right back around to that first sentence again and begin revising, and then sort of revise my way through until, over and over again, until I begin to, in fact, like the sentences a little bit.
So in a way, the distraction is silencing the inner critic?
Yes. And silencing sort of any sort of actual thinking. I don't even know if it's just the inner critic. I think I don't like to do any thinking about the story when I'm in the early stages of writing it.
Mm-hmm. So what are the best distractions?
I write in coffee shops a lot, and so other people's conversations, music. I often have headphones on. Or just stopping and talking to people a lot, or drinking coffee, or sometimes having a beer. Anything besides sort of just writing. What I really like is for there to be a conversation going on at my table, to have 3 or 4 different things to drink, that I can sort of move between coffee, water, soda, something. And then for people around us to be talking about their lives or about television, and then also to be on Twitter at the same time.
At the same time as you're writing.
Yeah. So I can sort of very quickly sort of move in and out of the story. So spend a little time and then move away at speed.
Yeah.
Come back to a little bit more, move
Wow.
away at speed. Yeah.
And so talk a little bit about typing out other people's stories. We hear about other writers in the past doing that a lot, where you'd learn something by typing out a novel by Hemingway. What is it about inhabiting the mechanical process of writing other people's sentences that helps get you out of feeling stuck between two writing sessions?
Well, I think part of it was that it was kind of a warm-up exercise. One of the first stories I think that I typed out was maybe an Octavia Butler story. So part of it was just for sort of to warm up towards writing my own stuff, which I didn't want to do. And the other thing was that it was a much slower way to read. I read pretty fast. And if I'm typing something out, then I'm having to read it much more slowly. And then at a certain point, even if I'm not enthusiastic about the idea of writing, then as I'm typing, I begin to think about alternate choices. Not that the writer should have made them, but just I can see sort of alternate paths for sentences or for sort of certain kinds of narrative decisions. And that's interesting. And so enough of that. And then when I start working on my own stuff, that part of the brain is awake, where I can start thinking, here are all the different things you could do, which might be interesting. Here are the reasons why you wouldn't want to do some of them.
Right. Well, in the course of the 10 years of writing the various stories for Get in Trouble, you also became a mom. Was there anything about that experience or getting experiences that you didn't have pre-motherhood that, when you look back now, changed some of the things that either you were interested in or the ways in which you might have written stories because of a shift in concerns?
Well, I mean, our daughter was born at 24 weeks, and we spent a year and a half in hospital with her after she was born. And so, I'm lucky because I work at home. My husband does too. We have an office, but the work's very portable. And so we did a lot of the work first in the NICU where she was, and then in the two other hospitals where she ended up. And we read a lot of books to her. And I don't necessarily love reading out loud, again, because I can read much faster if I'm just reading. Reading out loud slows it down. But that was pleasurable, seeing which book she seemed to like. And we had a lot of really weird data points because she was always hooked up to a monitor. So you could see with some of the books that we read to her the most often, you would see her heart rate go down and her oxygen saturation improve.
Wow.
And it's still the case that, if she has a bad dream and I go in the bedroom, I can, say a couple of lines from the two books that she loved the best, and her breathing, quiets down and she goes back to sleep really easily. So it's it was a reminder of how effective, I guess, patterns of words are even before you understand what they mean.
Can I ask what one of those
sure.
books were?
The two books that we read the most often were Each Peach, Pear Plum by Janet and Alan Van Allsburg. No, sorry, it's Janet and Alan Allsburg, I think. Anyway, the book is Each Peach, Pear Plum. It's the book that I give most often as a baby present. And it's a nursery rhyme with pictures. And the other book is by a writer named Chris Rushka, and it's called Charlie Parker Played Bebop. And there's a lot of nonsense sounds in it. And it's very satisfying to read out loud.
Another concern of Get in Trouble is the issue of, it seems to me, of class. And there's both, I think, some class anxiety in the book, but also certain stories that privilege people that have a lot in a world where that not everybody does. Do you think this is just part and parcel for apocalyptic or dystopian future fiction because we think of those disparities which are worsening in real time being worse out into the future? Or is that something that you really discovered that was on your mind as a concern when you were writing them?
It was not really on my mind when I was writing the stories. But yes, I think it is sort of a thing that you see a lot of in young adult fiction and in fantasy and science fiction, and in especially sort of post-apocalyptic, stuff like The Hunger Games.
Right.
And I didn't really think about it too hard until I put the collection together, and then began to think about the number of characters in it who were either famous or seemed to be very good looking according to the way that I had written them, or else had a lot of money, which, is useful in terms of telling a story. It sort of pushes it into more of a fable territory, but it also was kind of an easy shortcut in some ways and made me feel a little bit strange.
An easy shortcut?
It's a shortcut to allowing you to do certain things that are fun for readers, I think, which is describe some of the stuff that a lot of money or a lot of magic buys.
Right.
Yeah.
But it also sort of casts the shadow of knowing the people that aren't being described, who are also implied.
Sure, absolutely. But,
Yeah.
The stories are often about the fun bits, which are much more about the people who have access to all the fun.
It's true.
And they're miserable
Right.
too, because that's part of stories. But,
Right.
they're miserable while having a lot of exciting stuff.
What about your work as an editor at Small Bear Press and with the zine? How does that inflect the way you write, if it does? Do you feel like there's some crossover, or are they two separate hats, really?
Well, they're kind of separate hats. I think the thing that's been the most useful is probably the same thing that I get from teaching and from workshops, which is learning how to, especially when we work with somebody, with a novelist, reading through their novel and thinking very carefully about how the book could be, I'm not going to say improved, but where are the points where you feel them sort of pulling back maybe, or where are the points where maybe they know what stuff means, but you need it to be brought out a little bit more.
Right.
What are metaphors maybe that underlie the book? And, are they all metaphors that the writer wants to be there? Or do you want to sort of tamp some of them down? And so all of that, and also, and then lastly, sort of learning how to articulate those things in a way which is useful to the writer and serves the book that they actually want to write, as opposed to the things that you as a reader think would be fun or would sort of that you would do as a writer. So you have to sort of take out your own impulses and think really hard about what the impulses are of the person whose book it actually is.
Well, as a person who's both an editor and a writer, do you seek out readers and editorial feedback for your writing, or do you go a different route because you have a developed skill set there?
Both. I mean, I have a lot of people who will read stuff for me early on, often as I'm writing it, Holly Black and Cassandra Clare, and will give me feedback. Gavin does as well. But one of the things about getting a lot of feedback is that if you're lucky, then what you begin to develop is a willingness to hear it, and then sort of an ability to think, yes, that's useful, or no, I can't do that. And maybe to understand those reasons, but at least to have this sort of sense of whether it's serves a story that you want to tell to pursue those things.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Tell us about any writers that you're particularly jazzed about right now.
Well, I just had lunch with one of my favorite writers, Molly Gloss.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love her work. And I was thinking of her when you were talking about Alice Munro, because I think they're very similar in the sense that the work that they do goes down really easy, but they're doing enormously complicated things to pull that off.
And what's weird about that too, I know before we were on air, we were talking a little bit about gender politics in literature, is it feels like it goes down easy and people don't talk about it. But I also feel like I wonder if it's like, say, Alice Munro, because she's a woman and she's writing about domestic Ontario and Canada, that people aren't looking at the experimentation in the way they do when Philip Roth writes it or someone else writes it who's a man.
I mean, I think we're now at a point with Alice Munro where everybody knows how good she is, although I think you're right that they don't talk about some of the very complicated things that she does. Even Jonathan Franzen loves Alice Munro.
Right.
So,
but it is true that you don't think she's this, I mean, all the things she does with time and flashbacks and just the crazy way she defies all of the rules isn't what her reputation on the surface is about.
No, it in fact seems to be sometimes just people who have decided that she's important without really wanting to talk about why. And the thing is that I think maybe that's partly because she's a woman, but the fact that she has continued to write short stories and really focus on those, that she gets an appropriate amount of credit for sticking to something that a lot of people don't pay attention to.
That's a good point.
And I do think that there is also a tendency sometimes to dismiss work because it seems of a particular place. So Western writers, people maybe on the East Coast think, well, that's not about me, or this is a historical novel set in the West.
Right. So like Molly Gloss might be writing a Western, and there might be people who don't think they would be interested in it.
Right. And they are so wrong. I just, I really feel that my goal in life is to make people read the books that I like.
Yeah. Well, could you name a couple others?
Catherine Davis. I love her work. I'm rereading some of her novels.
I've been meaning to read Duplex, but I haven't read it.
Oh, it's so good. Really astonishing. And then I'm going to name a writer, a science fiction writer, Charlie Strauss, who's been writing a really fun, slightly pulpy, Lovecraftian-influenced espionage series about a group called The Laundry, who are the British Secret Service, except they fight monsters. And they're so fun and so enjoyable. I wish somebody would make a TV series out of it.
Well, you're a big watcher of some series, right? Like, I know you like The Vampire Diaries.
I love The Vampire Diaries.
Yeah. Any other ones that you would point people to?
We have been rewatching Buffy because we thought, well, we're really enjoying this vampire show. We should go back and watch Buffy as well, which I loved the first time around.
How's it holding up?
It is good. It's a little painful because you know it's coming. So
right.
On the one hand, you don't have the anxiety about what's going to happen. On the other hand, you think, well, I know it's going to happen, and it's terrible.
Yeah.
Not in the sense that it's poorly written, but just painful. We've started watching Black Mirror, which is really great, and recently started watching Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which is a cop show.
With Andy Samberg,
Andy
right?
Samberg. And, the thing is, I don't really want, at this point in my life, to be watching a cop show. It's very uncomfortable in certain regards, and yet the cast is incredible.
Huh.
It's a great cast. The characters are all amazing. They're really, really funny. It is much more pleasurable than most sort of comedy TV I've seen in a long time. And then the last one I would recommend is a British show called The Book Group.
Huh, I've never heard of it.
There were 2 seasons of it, and it's about an American woman who moves to Glasgow and is lonely, so she decides to advertise for people to come and join a book group, and she does. And the people who are joined there, I think there are 3 footballers' wives. And there's a Glaswegian, Ned, just this guy, who turns out actually to be having an affair with one of the husbands of one of the footballers' wives.
Oh, wow.
And 2 other people. And it is really painfully funny. It's one of my favorite TV shows. We watch it every couple of years.
Huh. Before we end today, you mentioned that your short stories are lengthening, and maybe that means you're moving towards the novel form. Is that actually true? Are you aiming towards the novel form in the future? And if not, what are you working on?
Well, I have to write a novel. I signed a contract to write a novel for Random House.
So the pressure's on.
Pressure is on.
All right.
I realize part of the reason why I'm enjoying this tour so much is because I don't have to write a novel while I'm on it. And then I'll get home and I'll have to start, looking at the stuff that I have. And
so you have started.
I have a tiny pieces.
A tiny bit.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not going to push you on that.
Thanks.
It was great having you on Between the Covers today, Kelly.
Thank you. My pleasure.
We were talking today to writer Kelly Link about her latest short story collection, Get in Trouble. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host.